Prime Minister, great pleasure to have you back. I must say that for a Brit, it's somewhat striking to come back one year to the next and still find the same Prime Minister here, because it's not been our experience recently in my own country.
The next British Prime Minister is going to be the 7th Prime Minister. I will have the honor of meeting.
Yes, 7th in 10 years, I think, is quite extraordinary. But variety is the spice of life, anyway. You've just come back from the NATO summit, so perhaps that is a place to start, from the summit in Ankara. There's always an excitement when there's a NATO summit with Donald Trump present. You never quite know what is going to happen. But apparently love broke out at this summit. So could you tell us your impressions of what you take away from Ankara?
Well, first of all, let's distinguish between the public remarks that were made before the summit and after the summit, and what actually happened during the summit itself. And I think that the summit in itself was quite successful because it reconfirmed the important decisions that were taken last year. The most important decision taken last year was the necessity of Europe and the European members of NATO to really step up in terms of taking real ownership over our own security. We've set ambitious targets in terms of defense spending, with Horizon to reach a cumulative of 5% of defense spending by 2035, that's 3.5% core defense spending and 1.5% defense-related spending, and most European countries have made significant progress towards that end. Greece has already met the 2035 targets as of 2026, and this puts us in a sort of an elite club of only 5 NATO members who have already achieved that goal. So we've been very consistent in terms of meeting our NATO obligations. But it is very encouraging to see that other European countries are also stepping up. And of course, this discussion is also connected to the overall debate surrounding the European defense initiatives and the need for the European Union to take more ownership when it comes to defense-related issues. There's a discussion related to this concept of European strategic autonomy, developing our defense industry, supporting the numerous startups that are beginning to emerge across Europe to offer innovative and cost-effective solutions to real battleground problems. So I'd say all in all, it was a successful summit. There's always some drama and some excitement involved when the American president makes on-the-record remarks, but all good at the end.
Very good. Well, one blip for Greeks may be the F-35s and the potential sale to Turkey. We talked about this a little bit in the conference today with Minister Denyas, but interested to get your perspective on that potential sale.
I don't think we do justice to the importance of the decisions taken at the summit when we just limit the public debate in Greece around issues related to the Greek-Turkish relationship. When we have issues to discuss with Turkey, we discuss them amongst ourselves. And sometimes in Greece, I think we take a very narrow-minded approach when it comes to these broader issues. Again, the important message coming out of the summit is related to the fact that Europe is spending more on defense. And that is the only way to also convince the United States and the US president that we take our defense seriously. So I'm not going to make any further comments regarding this topic. I spoke about it briefly yesterday, but I'm always sort of surprised by how part of the Greek media reports on these issues with a great degree of exaggeration and an inability to really understand the complex dynamics that we're faced. So let's leave it at that. Okay. I don't have anything further to add on this topic.
Sure. The backdrop to the NATO summit was, of course, a resumption of strikes in the Gulf by Iran and by America, and the security situation remains perplexing, I suppose. So from your perspective, President Metsola, how do you view this, and what do you think that Europe's role can be in trying to at least find some sort of way forward in a very tricky situation?
So first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here on your 30th anniversary of this great annual event. Happy to share the stage with Kyriakos at this beautiful place. I would say, you mentioned 22, which is the year when, as soon as I got elected, a couple of weeks later, Russia invaded Ukraine. And I would say that the agenda of the Parliament has completely shifted to one that focuses a lot, much more than ever, on security. We would not talk about defense before. We were very far away, and that's to put it mildly, on the targets of the 2%, the original 2%. If you think going back to 2014, 2 or 3 countries maximum had reached them. Now you have almost all countries that in Europe that are reaching the targets. Massive increase in defense expenditure. If you think, you look at the core defense expenditure of Europe and Canada in order to bring up the targets, and also in terms of capability, innovation, research, and investment in Europe. And it is against that backdrop that we approach any of the challenges we have, both in our continent, in our immediate neighborhood, and in areas which affect us massively, not only in terms of security, but also economically. So this is why we have called for de-escalation repeatedly. We see also the strikes taking place against the Gulf states at a very perilous moment. We see the volatility and of prices of oil and gas, even though they're not as volatile as the worst scenario could predict them to be today. But we're going into an extremely difficult summer and autumn, and a very unpredictable 2027. And if we can't project to our citizens the ability to give them stability of what they pay at the end of the month, what the challenges will be, then we will start to see much bigger unrest than we see today. We're sort of managing in the European Parliament. It's an extremely difficult institution to run. We have 8 political groups with 720 colleagues from 27 member states. We find majorities, but I can tell that these will be harder and harder to manage if the challenges both in our continent and in our immediate neighbourhoods continue to grow.
So you talk about, of course, the Parliament, but what is the role of the Parliament on these issues? Can the Parliament really come into play, or people seem to look to their national governments more than the European Parliament?
Well, actually, in times of big challenges as we're facing today, if you ask, even in Greece, majority of citizens say, we trust the continent and Europe to keep stability. And that is not a given in a time when there are no challenges. If anything, we have been for many years benefiting from the so-called peace dividend, where citizens looked away, to a certain extent didn't vote anymore, expressed frustration, etc. So now it's up to us. And the responsibility we have is not only in humanitarian aid, in terms of being the budgetary authority of the Union, in terms of making sure that we have a security infrastructure that works, making military mobility a legislative possibility, something that was impossible before, having a legislative framework where our innovation, our industries are not stuck at borders. All of that is legislation that is debated and voted on within the European Parliament. In the wider angle, we also vote on each and every trade deal. So 3 weeks ago, we voted on the EU-US trade deal. It was a difficult, let's say, target to reach. But we were clear, there are 16 million jobs on both sides of the Atlantic that depended on this trade deal, and we had no choice but to vote in favor. Similarly, 2 days ago, we voted on new trade deals after 26 years with Mexico. India's coming up. All of this would have taken years in the past. The Parliament has recognized it. We are much faster than we ever were. I always would like us to be faster, but we build majorities and we move.
So, and that leads on, I think, to the broader security and geopolitical framework. Prime Minister, I can ask you, where does Europe stand now between the United States, China, the great powers in the world? How does Europe position itself for the world where there is a risk that the big decisions are taken over the heads of Europe?
I thought I would get an easier question on your 30th anniversary.
Important question.
Look, I think over the past years, and as a result of the war in Ukraine, but also because of some important reports that were written, and I'm referring to the Draghi and the letter report, there has been a sense of sort of almost a brutal awakening at the level of the European Council when it comes to Europe's role in this changing geopolitical and geoeconomic landscape. And it is no surprise that the priorities laid out by the Commission, by the Council, but also by the Parliament, focus around these two critical issues: competitiveness on the one hand, security and defense on the other. And all the initiatives that we take are moving in that direction. Unless we fix the competitiveness imbalance with the US and with China, Europe is going to continue to decline. Important decisions have to be taken in that direction. If you look at the speed at which we have implemented the recommendations of the Draghi report, it's probably not what we would like. But I think Roberta was very correct to point out that Europe is a very complex institutional construction, which involves lots of compromise. It has three pillars, the Commission, the Council, the Parliament, and they all at some point need to agree when it comes to the important decisions. And this, of course, does take time. Having said that, the issues are addressed with a new sense of urgency. When we talk about competitiveness, we have to look at the single market and the way it functions, or the problems that it still has. Roberta referred, and rightly so, to the cost of living crisis, which is something that affects all our citizens. But if you look at the single market now, it is difficult for me to explain why the same product costs more in Greece than it costs in another European country, even if you account for the cost of transport. So there are still basic things that need to be fixed within the single market. This notion of the 28th regime, the ability of a startup.
We were talking, I think, 2 years ago.
Yeah, to be able to be created, for example, in Greece, but be registered in Poland or in Lithuania and be able to do business there. All these are important ideas that need to become law and need to be implemented. And of course, the difficulty is always to ensure that these bold suggestions are not watered down in the process and not overcome by European bureaucracy or by the necessity to achieve compromises at the level of the European Parliament. When we talk about energy, we are simply not competitive when it comes to energy prices in Europe, and there are still significant discrepancies between the prices of energy across different European countries. So we don't actually have a single market of energy. Yes, we're looking at the grids package, improve connectivity, but all of this needs to move at a much faster speed. And finally, when it comes to trade, I am a proponent of free trade agreements, and at a time when there is more geopolitical tension around trade, it is to the interest of Europe to complete these free trade deals with, you mentioned Mexico. India is an incredibly important market. And of course, I speak also as a country which is a global leader in shipping. And shipping is the lifeline for international trade. So I have an additional interest when it comes to these initiatives. And finally, when you look at China, important decisions need to be taken when it comes to the survival of our manufacturing base in Europe. I'm not in favor of protectionism per se, and many of the problems of European competitiveness are not related to China, but one cannot ignore the fact that China currently accounts for 30% of the world's manufacturing capability and 14% of the world's economy. So we cannot afford, especially for critical sectors where we retain a competitive advantage, to be flooded by Chinese goods that will eventually result in hundreds of thousands or millions of jobs being lost in Europe.
If you say you're not in favor of protectionism, but what are you in favor then of in order to defend the industries that risk being flooded, as you put it?
You will need to do both. For example, if you give your car industry, I'm slightly agnostic when it comes to the car industry because we are not part of the European supply chain, so I don't have...
But you have 35% tariffs on EVs, right? So.
But the question is, okay, if I do protect for some time my car industry, will I give enough incentives to the European car industry to innovate and to reach the level of sophistication that the Chinese cars currently have? Because this is no longer a question of price. We need to understand that the combination of AI and robotics in China is creating a manufacturing powerhouse which is much more sophisticated than we understand. So if we take protective measures, we need to ensure that we also look at the other side of the ledger. Make our industry more competitive, address issues of bureaucracy, pass the omnibus laws that make doing business in Europe easier, because protection by itself is not going to do the trick.
Yes, President Metsola, I know competitiveness is a theme that you spend a lot of time on, and I believe you were recently in California touring American tech companies.
Touring is a big word, okay.
So, so what did you take back from that sort of experience? I mean, China is a powerhouse, but so is America.
Yeah. Kyriakos was mentioning competitiveness, and in a way, it's every second sentence you find that word, with us trying to answer how we're going to reach that strategic autonomy that has eluded us for over a decade now. But at the same time, we need to match it with a clear understanding of where our dependencies lie. We can talk, yes, about the automotive sector. We can talk about the imports of non-European-made cars, not only Chinese, so the numbers are petering out there. Secondly, in terms of our dependence on battery production, semiconductors, chips, that is the big discussion we had when I went to California to meet the leader of the tech companies who see Europe as their most important market, 450 million consumers who are willing to continue to invest, to research their products from a continent where talent is extremely high. If you compare the number of AI professionals in Europe when compared to China and the US, our numbers per capita are much higher, but then our investment is minuscule compared. When it comes to how we innovate, the amount of patents we create in technology, we are at the very top of the game. But that then dilutes into productivity. How much do we manage to produce? At what cost? We are very proud standard setters, but those standards will not be relevant anymore if we don't produce anymore. And I think it's this balance between us having always led in every revolution. The next one will be AI. Where are we going to be? Are we just going to be a very wealthy consuming continent? Or are we going to be one which really looks at investment, data centers, making sure our people, the best we have, stay here, but also continue to be a market that other global companies invest in, whether in terms of talent, in terms of production, in terms of competition. You see big differences between member states on this. So some member states are more dependent on imports from outside the European Union. Some member states have different ideas of what it means to be protectionist. Do we talk about everything that is made in Europe or made with Europe? Are we talking about making it easier for third countries to invest in Europe? Or are we going to make it for us more autonomous to have supply chains that start and end in this continent? And that is, I think, a discussion that we need to be having. I sometimes feel that we're sort of observing this, and this is the speed issue that Kyriakos was mentioning, that I sometimes look at the processes and realize that this, at a time when tens of thousands of jobs are being announced, being lost in some countries, and we're, stuck on an omnibus that could go much faster.
So, with that in mind, with the need for speed, perhaps, Kyriakos, you could pick up some of these rhetorical questions that you put. What is Europe going to do? An observer or a player in an originator or a user of AI?
If you look at capital expenditures on AI infrastructure, what we call the AI stack, it is clear that Europe is significantly lagging behind the US and China. At the same time, there is a very vibrant debate about the concept of AI sovereignty. Where do we keep our sensitive data, and what is the necessity to invest in Europe to ensure that, at least when it comes to where the data actually is, that we're not dependent on the United States, because China would clearly not be an option. At the end of the day, as much as we offer in terms of public money, European money or national money, the bulk of the funding when it comes to these investments is private capital, which brings us again to the question of the ability to mobilize these sums at the European level, which is again connected to the topic of the Savings and Investment Union. Why is it that our savings are being directed to the US only to possibly be reinvested in Europe through the US? So we need a much greater mobilization of private capital to at least be able to compete when it comes to the infrastructure of AI. For example, the European Union is now going to finance a certain number of what we call AI, gigafactories, gigaprojects, and we hope that Greece can also play a role in this development. And for a country the size of Greece, we probably would be aiming for one, flagship, big project. We already have our new supercomputer, which, as we speak, is in the process of being installed close to here at Lavrio, and this computing power is critical in order to offer the government, but also the startups computing capability to develop at least, the necessary AI applications. So right now, the jury is still out whether Europe is going to be able to play ball when it comes to the LLMs of this world, but we certainly need to be able to be active in the application layer, which is at the end of the day the tools that will develop the solutions to improve our productivity. So there I see a lot of dynamism. When I look at Greece, I see lots of very interesting startups that are developing products and services in this space, but each country will also need its own national strategy, and we need to ensure that when it comes to regulation, we need to be smart and flexible. Because when I hear some of the big US companies telling us we're not going to offer some of our products to Europe as a whole because we are restricted by European regulation, I raised the question of whether we have taken some of our regulation maybe a step too far. When it came to data protection, we set the standards. When it comes to the AI Act, we were again ahead of the curve, but I think there are issues which need to be addressed, because I wouldn't want to be in a position not to have access to cutting-edge know-how simply because for some reasons we have made it a regulatory nightmare for these companies to operate in Europe.
So if we could step back to European architecture for a moment, the geopolitical architecture of Europe, there is the perennial question of countries that would like to join the European Union. And then there are questions of countries that are on the periphery or have left, like my own country, but are still European. So can you see in the future a European architecture that is somehow more flexible and allows countries that either for whatever reason are not yet ready for full membership, or countries that don't want full membership but need to be included in areas like defense, like the UK? How does Europe accommodate that wider world beyond the European Union itself?
If I can start by taking myself to a personal experience, every country, leaving the United Kingdom a little bit aside, but that joins the European Union, mine joined 22 years ago in the Big Bang enlargement of 2004. If you look at each of those countries today, the economic growth, the standards, and the quality of life that has been brought to those countries proves the point that enlargement is a win-win, not only for the countries seeking to join, but the countries that are already in the Union. You see the growth figures for these 10 countries, Poland being at the head of the list. This is something that 20 years ago was dominated by fear, discussions as to whether Europe would not look like Europe anymore, whether sovereignty was going to be forgotten at the altar of federalism. And if you look back now to the fact that the last country to join the European Union was in 2012, Croatia. 10 years ago, the United Kingdom left. Today, we have more than 10 countries who would like to join. Iceland, that is going to hold a referendum at the end of August. Also, that would not have happened if the current geopolitical situation was not so volatile. You have countries like Canada and the UK who would like to enter the SAFE program. You have discussions, and I'm glad that we're having these discussions as to what are, I would say, the steps to be taken before enlargement. Each country has its own path, it's based on merit, but let's not leave those countries hanging forever. We have been in countless Western Balkan summits where Kyriakos is always at the lead of saying we cannot leave this meeting with zero progress. 3 or 4 weeks ago, we were in Montenegro for the EU Western Balkan Summit, where Montenegro is leading in terms of candidacy and all the accession treaty is already being drafted. And that was, I would say, the first summit where I left with a little bit of optimism that, wow, these are countries that fly our flag high. These are countries that run election after election on the basis of hope, of joining the European Union, being part of Europe, because it's synonymous. How are we who are inside, who have such a success story to tell, going to tell them, wait another 6 months? And I think that we're finally on a path of discussion where this win-win debate is catching up. Will we still have fear-mongering? Absolutely. Will we still have this idea that Europe should stay as is? But if there's one thing we've learned, is that stagnation never helps. And if you go always for the status quo, then you're just going to disappoint those who look at this continent as one of the future.
Prime Minister?
Well, on the question of various types of cooperation, this to a certain extent already exists. within the European Union. Not all countries are members of Schengen, not all countries are members of the Eurozone, so there is already a degree of variable geometry, and the treaties and the way the European Union works is able to accommodate for specific priorities of member states. Defense is going to be an interesting test, whether we will be able to develop a core group of countries that could do more when it comes to European defense collaboration. Safe to a certain extent.
Could the UK be in that? I mean, I don't just ask because I'm British, although it makes it of special interest to me, but it is a serious defense, one of the two nuclear powers in Europe and with serious defense capabilities.
Okay. We first have to make it work for the European Union, and if you're talking about sort of a coalition of the willing, when it comes to EU countries, we first need to be able to formalize that, and to a certain extent, it is happening at an ad hoc level. So you have bilateral or trilateral cooperations. This leads to the standardization of procurement. For example, when we buy a French frigate, which we have, we essentially went to the French and said, we basically want the same ship that you're building with minimum sort of changes to the basic design. This is creating economies of scale. Then the Swedes may come and also buy the same ship. This creates more countries that are actually using the same platform. So you're starting to see various sort of circles of countries able to cooperate when it comes to defense. And SAFE is also a program that is encouraging procurement across member states. Now, whether the UK could be a member of such an initiative, difficult to tell. There were ways for the UK to join SAFE, but it didn't work out at the end because, of course, there are certain prerequisites that have to be met. And back to the question of enlargement, of course, Greece as a country belonging to the region of Southeast Europe has a great interest in seeing our Western Balkan neighbors progress towards the European Union. And the truth is that we have repeatedly delivered promises that have not been kept, also to a certain extent because these countries were not able to progress at the speed with which was required according to the very rigorous European accession process. It is encouraging that Montenegro could become the 28th, I don't want to add insult to injury, but would replace the UK as a 28th EU member. This is a distinct possibility. It could happen within the next 2 years, and it would send a signal to the Western Balkans that this is actually not a pipe dream. This is something that can happen. But having said that, every single country is treated on its own rights. There are important issues which need to be addressed, and we are here to support our Western Balkan friends in this difficult journey. But if we were to have progress on even one country, that would set a signal. Having said that, I need to point out that we need to make progress on Serbia, because we have not been able to open a single chapter when it comes to Serbia for 4 years. At some point, it's easy to play the blame game. It's your fault, it's our fault. But Serbia is 50% of the GDP of the Western Balkans, and one could not envision the Western Balkans being stable and European without a European Serbia. Maybe we need there to convince some of our friends at the Council to take a small leap of faith, because we also need to send a signal to Serbia that we are actually interested in bringing them on the right track.
I think we had a Dutch veto just this week on the Serbian question.
Sorry?
We had a Dutch veto this week, I think,
yeah.
didn't we, on that? Mm-hmm. I want to raise something that I know you've both been dealing with over the years quite a bit, but which seems to have dropped in salience, and I want to understand why it's dropped, and that is migration. It's not that it's gone away, but it seems to have gone down. Is this because the problem has been, to some degree, effectively dealt with, or is it still looming very large on your radar? So perhaps.
A little bit both. I would say, and I have run for 5 European elections, and each one of them, because I'm from the Mediterranean, has been dominated by migration. First, in terms of where is Europe? Secondly, in terms of can solidarity that is shown in so many areas be shown also in this field? Thirdly, how is our returns policy and security framework going to match the asylum part of migration? So we found ourselves in a situation a few years ago when we said if we don't legislate at European level, we're never going to address it. Well, I'm not saying solve, but address the challenges, each member state having their own. Whether you have a land border, a sea border, you are a landlocked country, you have hybrid threats, how people come in, etc., labor market mobility, labor market gaps, etc. So we found ourselves a few years ago where we said we're going to adopt the so-called Migration Pact, which was a set of pieces of legislation, which we did. And we did that just months before the 2024 European elections, because we had to go back to our citizens and say, we have found a way to address this challenge at European level. There was still one last remaining file, which was returns, where there was a realization that when compared to the number of failed applications, the number of returns was incredibly low. And that meant that you need to have cooperation with third countries. You need to talk to countries in our neighborhood, talk with them, not at them. You need agreements, and you also need understanding, keeping in mind that we're talking about human beings, and we're talking about some of the most vulnerable people on the planet. That vote went through about 3 weeks ago, and that, in essence, concludes the pact. Double that or partner it with the fact that numbers have decreased. And they've decreased because of cooperation agreements with neighboring countries. They've decreased because of the fact that bilaterally there has been a more effective measure. But the fact is that we have fundamental differences between member states because of their geographical realities, but also some differences of ideology between member states that you can see also in the parliament, which I would say come into how the votes go. But conclusion, the pact is concluded, has been voted in, and we just have to wait for it to be implemented because it's entered into force.
Migration does not rank in the top probably 10 issues that concern Greek society today.
Which is a change, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a big change, but I'll tell you why. Because when we came into power in 2019, we had 30,000 people on the island of Lesbos, illegal migrants, refugees. You know how many we have now? 300. And instead of having migrants and refugees on the islands of the Eastern Med, we have thousands of Turkish visitors who come with a fast-track visa to visit the islands, because we've been able to manage the problem by working with Turkey, but also by sending a very, very clear signal since the very beginning of our first term that we will protect our external borders. We were faced with a hybrid attack back in March 2020. And I was the first at the time to bring the leadership of the European Union to the land border with Turkey to send a very clear signal that unless we highlight the external dimension of migration, the problem will not be solved, because the discussion in Europe only related to secondary flows. And it was a zero-sum game. We could never solve this problem unless we address the fact that we had too many people coming into Europe in the first place. So we were unapologetic. We said to the smugglers and to the possible desperate people who were willing, however, to pay big sums of money to the smugglers, that we will make it very difficult for you to enter Europe. And, of course, now that the pact is completed, If you're not entitled asylum, so if you're an economic refugee, we will send you back. And now we have the tools to actually do so. So we were, I think, at the forefront of changing the European debate and moving the European Council towards a much more pragmatic direction, which was also adopted by the Parliament. And that is why we now have a pact that has to be implemented. It's interesting. Returns do work because they send a very clear signal to the possible clients of the smugglers that there's a good chance that you will pay $5,000 or $10,000 or euros and you will be sent back. So when we started sending back people to Egypt, and we're not talking about huge numbers, the symbolism was very important. Suddenly we saw a significant reduction in the number of Egyptians coming through Libya. And of course, Roberta is right, we have to work with third countries. We're working, for example, with Eastern Libya to help them with their Coast Guard, offering them assets, because we don't want these people to be at sea in the first place, because it's a very dangerous trip, and thousands of people have been lost, and my Coast Guard has saved tens of thousands of people at sea, but we don't want them to leave the coast in the first place. So I do think that we have contributed towards reframing the debate in Europe, and overall, when you look at the way we have handled migration, it has been a successful policy. And having said that, for those people who are entitled asylum status, we're happy to welcome them. They can come, they can stay in Greece, they can, we have enough jobs. We have Sudanese people working now in the fields in central Greece, where we have a need for labor. And of course, we also want to conclude labor mobility agreements with countries with which we feel we have a good relationship, because we want these people to come legally. We want them to come legally, we want them to come on a plane rather than on a dinghy, we want them to be insured, and we want them to contribute to the growth of the economy, but in a legal way.
We have just a few minutes left, so very quickly, penultimate question to you on democracy and elections. We have a number of important elections coming up. You will know better than anybody else in this room when the next Greek election will be. France, you've already decided. France holds perhaps the most important election. How do you see perhaps this is for you, President Metsola, how do you see the health of European democracy at the moment, and perhaps the perils as well that it faces?
Well, 2027 will be, a jumbo election year, where if you think that Italy, France, Poland, Spain will go to elections, and that's after...
Don't forget Greece.
I'll leave you to handle Greece, so... I'll mention all the other countries, so Sweden, Finland, I can continue, Estonia, but it's clear that if you look at the difficulties being faced by governments across the Union and the challenges, of course you could always say this is the most consequential election year we've ever had, but suffice it to say that the next few months will be the most consequential election months we would have ever had. And why do I say this? Because we have a challenge, first of all, to make sure people vote. And this is something we've seen not only on our continent, but across the world, where the temptation is to stay home. Secondly, to make sure that you have as healthy a representative list to vote for as possible, that you can represent all sections of society. Thirdly, that you commit to a program that is going to make citizens' lives just a little bit easier. And see, our voters are not asking for too much. So if they ask us for security, they ask us for jobs, and they ask us for a house that they can live with dignity in. For many years, I think we looked away from that. And that is the state of democracy that we are facing, but it's up to us. And our elections are in 2029, so we're 2 years away from after we've had 1 and 3 years away. But this is the moment to gain trust. This is the moment to show that if you've asked us very clearly what you expect from Europe, then we are the ones who have to respond. And that's what we're doing with difficulty, but with majorities that we find. And then, as I said at the beginning, we just move forward.
Do you have a quick word on Greece?
Well, as you know, we have just entered our 8th year in power, and we will have an election in 2027 in the spring. I'm sick and tired of repeating this. I'm being asked all the time whether we will have an early election, but the election will take place at the end of our term. And of course, I think Roberta framed it correctly. I think citizens are realistic, but they're also concerned at the same time. We have major changes, happening in their lives. Climate change, AI, geopolitical realignment. A younger generation that does not know whether they will, whether their education is going to guarantee them a job. A younger generation that is looking for the basic right to actually own a house, which was a given for our generation. These are real challenges that need to be addressed. And I would say that the first guideline would be to be humble, to address these concerns with humility, and not to promise the moon. People are realistic. They understand that we cannot make dramatic changes, and that is why I think they're also quite skeptical when they hear, parties, populist parties from the right and the left promising solutions which clearly are unrealistic in terms of their fiscal consequences. So it's very easy to throw money at the problem, but the money is not there. And the countries that have tried it in the past, including my own, ended up almost going bankrupt. And we will not repeat the same mistake. So it is the responsibility of the responsible parties to ensure that whatever we propose is supported by the financial means to actually implement these policies. And this is exactly what we will do. And the temptation is always great to overpromise, but in 2 consecutive elections, we won an absolute majority by not overpromising. And when I look at what we have delivered in our 4th year, compared to what we promised we would do in 2023, we are more or less on target. We promised that we would further reduce unemployment. We did so. We promised that we would increase wages. We did so. We've increased the minimum wage by 42% over 9 years. We promised record foreign direct investment. We've delivered. We've promised to strengthen our armed forces. We have delivered. We've promised to protect workers, and we have actually delivered. We said we would digitize the state. We've done so. Of course, the elephant in the room is the affordability crisis. But you're not going to solve this crisis by simply claiming that you can basically write blank checks and send them to people and commit to measures which clearly cannot be funded. And one final point on the elections, which concerns both of us. The integrity of our elections is going to be challenged by AI. It's a reality. The capabilities of AI are just staggering in terms of creating fake videos, audios, whatever you can imagine. We desperately need to address this. And if there's one regulatory battle I would like to have with the tech companies is to ensure that we have some sort of watermarking technique to identify when a video is a product of AI. This is going to be absolutely critical. We have enough nasty people within our countries, but also outside the countries that would like to play havoc with our electoral process. It's an issue we've discussed. I've raised it repeatedly at the European Council. I don't think there will be time to do much before the next elections, but we should be aware that the next elections will be fought in a completely different digital environment from the previous ones.
Enough fodder for future conferences. I know that people won't forgive me if I didn't ask the question that is on many of your minds tonight in this room. So, in a nutshell, Greece or Morocco?
Sorry?
France.
Sorry, France or Morocco?
I wish it were Greece or Morocco.
France or Morocco?
Look, I've placed my bets on on France before the World Cup started. So I'll have to stick with
France.
with my initial prediction.
France or
I have
Morocco?
4 boys at
You're
home.
wearing the Morocco colors, so it
I
has
have,
to.
yeah, I'm wearing I have 4 boys at home. I think they're pretty tied, so let's see. Let's see. I would
Very
say
good.
France as well.
You're
but that's-
very diplomatic.
No, I said France.
No.